The morning Ada Carver was handed over like a parcel of disputed acreage. The sky above the Wyoming territory was the color of a fresh bruise, all purple and amber, and something that looked almost like regret. She stood in the middle of her father's yard with a single carpetbag at her feet, and her jaw set so hard the muscles along her neck had gone rigid, listening to the two men argue over her, as though she were a fence line that needed relocating. Her father, Edmund Carver, was a lean man with sun-cracked skin and eyes the color of dust, and beside him stood his neighbor, a red-faced cattleman named Roy Pickett, who owned the 300 acres of grazing land that butted up against the Carver property on the western edge. They had been fighting over that boundary for the better part of 2 years. Court filings, surveyor arguments, a broken nose belonging to Roy Pickett's eldest son that had caused Edmund Carver no small amount of legal trouble in the spring of 1878. It was now September of 1879, and somewhere in the collapsed logic of desperate men and too much whiskey the night before, Edmund Carver had offered his daughter as a settlement. Not in those exact words, perhaps. He had called it an arrangement. He had called it practical. He had said that Jeremiah Donovan, who was Roy Pickett's ranch foreman, and a man who had expressed some quiet interest in Ada at the church social the previous spring, was a good and steady man who needed a wife, and that if Ada were to marry Donovan, then Pickett might see his way clear to moving the disputed boundary line back 3 yards to where Edmund Carver had always insisted it belonged. Ada had not been consulted. She had been told at breakfast, while she was still holding her coffee cup, the steam rising between her and her father's averted eyes. "You will go to the Pickett ranch today," he had said. "Donovan is expecting you." "Expecting me," she had repeated very quietly. "It is a good match, Ada. He is 26 years old, owns a quarter share in the ranch, has a proper house of his own on the property. You could do considerably worse." "I have not been asked whether I want to marry anyone," she said. "The decision is made," her father said, and stood up from the table, and that had been the end of the conversation as far as Edmund Carver was concerned. Ada had gone upstairs and packed her carpetbag with the deliberate calm of a woman who was storing something very dangerous very carefully. She packed her good wool dress, her mother's small silver mirror, the book of poems she had read so many times the spine had given out, a change of linen, and the small folding knife she kept in her boot, because the Wyoming territory was not a place where a woman alone was without enemies. Then she had walked downstairs and stood in the yard and listened to her father and Roy Pickett speak about her as though she were acreage, and she had decided that whatever happened next, she would not cry. Not here, not in front of either of them. Roy Pickett's man brought a horse around. Ada mounted without assistance and did not look back at her father as she rode through the gate. She was 22 years old, and she had never felt so entirely alone in all her life, but she also had never felt so entirely clear about one thing, which was that she would not be a settlement. She would not be a parcel. She would not be disputed land waiting for someone else to decide where her edges fell. The Pickett Ranch was 4 miles west, and she rode those 4 miles with the early autumn wind pulling at the pins in her dark hair, and the carpetbag knocking against the saddle, and her thoughts turning over and over like a wheel in deep mud. She knew Jeremiah Donovan by sight and by brief conversation. She had spoken to him perhaps 5 times in her life, 3 of those at church, and once at the general store in Millhaven, when he had held the door for her with his hat in his hand, and said something polite about the weather. The 5th time was the church social her father had mentioned, where they had talked for perhaps 20 minutes beside the lemonade table about whether the new schoolteacher Miss Hargrove was settling in well, and he had laughed once at something she said, a real laugh, not a performance, and she had thought afterward that he had kind eyes. Brown, like good river water. Steady. She had thought about that laugh more than she cared to admit in the months since. But thinking about a man's laugh and being handed to him like a piece of contested land were 2 very different things, and Ada was clear-eyed enough to know the difference. The picket ranch came into view around a long bend, a sprawling operation with a main house, several outbuildings, a barn that was freshly painted red, and a smaller house set slightly apart from the rest near a line of cottonwood trees. That smaller house, she assumed, was Donovan's. A thin line of smoke came from its chimney, and she could see a figure moving in the yard in front of it, and as she rode closer the figure resolved into the shape of a tall man in a dark coat with his sleeves rolled to the elbow, carrying a water bucket from the well. He stopped when he saw her coming and set the bucket down and stood very still for a moment, watching her approach. Jeremiah Donovan was a man who had spent enough of his life outdoors that the weather had left its signature on him, but he wore it cleanly. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and that steady brown gaze she remembered. He was not handsome in the way that paintings or dime novels described handsome, but he had a quality of genuine attention about him that made you feel, when he looked at you, that he was actually seeing you rather than looking through you or past you at something more interesting. He had that quality now, standing in his yard, watching Ada Carver ride up to his fence on a borrowed horse with a carpetbag and an expression that could have cut glass. She stopped the horse at the fence and did not dismount. She looked at him directly because she had decided on the ride over that she would not let any of this make her small. "You are Jeremiah Donovan," she said. "I am," he said. "I am Ada Carver." "I know who you are, Miss Carver," he said, and his voice was careful and even, and she could not yet read what was underneath it. "Then you know why I am here," she said. "My father and your employer have decided that I am the appropriate resolution to their land disagreement, and that if I marry you the fence line moves 3 yards east and everyone is satisfied. Everyone," she added, "except for me, since no one thought to ask." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at her steadily, and she held his gaze and did not look away, and something shifted in his expression that she could not quite name. Then he said, "Who told you I agreed to this arrangement?" Ada blinked. That was not what she had expected him to say. "My father said you were expecting me," she said. "Pickett told me this morning that there was a solution to the boundary dispute in the works," Donovan said. "He did not tell me what it was. I had no idea it involved you." He paused, and his jaw tightened slightly. "I would not have agreed to it if I had known." The wind moved through the cottonwood trees along the fence, and the leaves made a sound like paper, and Ada sat on her horse and stared at him. "You would not have agreed to it," she repeated slowly. "You are not a piece of land, Miss Carver," he said. "You are not disputed. And frankly, the idea that your father offered you as a settlement is something I find deeply troubling." He picked up the water bucket he had set down. "You are welcome to get down from that horse and come inside and have some coffee and tell me what you actually want to do, because I will tell you right now that whatever you decide, I will do my best to make sure it happens." Ada sat very still on the horse for a long moment. She had ridden 4 miles steeling herself for an argument, for a door being shut in her face, for a man who saw her the same way her father did, as a useful arrangement to be made. She had not prepared herself for this. For someone who simply looked at her and said you are not disputed, and asked what she wanted. She dismounted. She tied the horse to the fence post with hands that were not quite steady. She picked up her carpetbag. She walked through the gate and across the yard and up the 2 wooden steps to Donovan's front porch, and he held the door open for her, and she went inside, and the smell of coffee and wood smoke and something that had been baking, bread maybe, met her like a warm hand. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly. "I will get the coffee." She sat down at the kitchen table, which was clean and plain and had a small jar of late-season wildflowers on it that surprised her somehow, that a man living alone would bother with wildflowers, and she set her carpetbag on the floor and looked around the room. It was a simple house, but it was cared for. There were shelves with books on them, real books, not just almanacs and farm catalogs. There was a clean curtain in the window. The stove was well maintained. There was a framed piece of needlework on the wall that said something in Irish that she could not read, and beside it a small photograph in an oval frame of a woman and a man she did not recognize. He put a cup of coffee in front of her and sat down across the table and folded his hands and looked at her. "Tell me what happened," he said, and something about the directness of it, the simple invitation to speak without preamble or apology, made Ada's carefully maintained composure crack just slightly at the edges, not enough to spill over, but enough that her voice, when she spoke, had more texture in it than she intended. She told him everything. She told him about the 2 years of the land dispute, about the court filings, about the broken nose, about her father's long, slow decline into desperation since her mother had died 3 years ago, and left him alone with the ranch and no son to help him and a daughter who did not know how to stop seeing clearly. She told him about being told at breakfast like it was a simple transaction. She told him about the carpet bag and the ride over and the way Roy Pickett had looked at her in the yard of her father's ranch, like she was a solution he was pleased to have found. Donovan listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "You have 2 choices as I see it, and they are both genuinely yours to make. The first is that I will ride over to your father's ranch today and tell him this arrangement is void and that he needs to find another resolution to his land dispute, and then I will make sure you have a way to wherever it is you want to go. The second is," he stopped. "Go on," she said. "The second is that I have wanted to ask if I might court you properly since last spring," he said, without any notable change in his expression, but with something in his eyes that she felt land somewhere in the center of her chest. "I did not because it seemed presumptuous, and because I am a foreman and you are the daughter of a landowner, and I thought you would likely find someone better situated. But I am telling you now because you should have the full truth of what your options are." He held her gaze steadily. "If you wanted, at some point, to consider being courted properly, I would like that. But that is a separate matter from this, and it would be entirely your decision, and I would not rush you, and I would not press you, and if you said no, I would still make sure you had what you needed." Ada looked at him for a long time. "You are a strange man, Jeremiah Donovan," she said finally. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "So I have been told. What you are describing, the second option," she said carefully, "that is not what my father arranged." "No," he agreed. "It is not. What your father arranged was not right, and I want to be clear that I take no part in it and hold no expectation based on it. If you choose to allow me to court you, it would be because you want that and for no other reason." Ada wrapped both her hands around her coffee cup and thought about the ride over, about the set of her own jaw, about the wildflowers in the jar on the table, and the books on the shelves, and the laugh she had thought about for months. "The land dispute," she said. "If I do not marry you, what happens to my father's property?" "I cannot promise you anything about what Pickett decides to do," Donovan said honestly. "But I can tell you that the original boundary survey I have seen suggests your father's claim is the stronger one, and if he takes it back to court with the right surveyor's testimony, he likely wins. I can arrange for that surveyor if it would help." She stared at him. "Why would you do that? Pickett is your employer." "Pickett is wrong about the boundary," Donovan said simply. "I have worked for men I respected, and I have worked for men I did not agree with, and I am capable of separating those things. Your father's land is your father's land. That has nothing to do with whether I would like to call on you on Sunday afternoons." Ada set down her coffee cup. She looked at the wildflowers. She thought about 22 years of being in a place where she had not been asked what she wanted, and she thought about this man sitting across from her who had asked within 5 minutes of her arrival. "You may call on me on Sunday afternoons," she said. "But I would like to be clear that I am agreeing to be courted, not to be handed over, and that I reserve every right to change my mind." "Those are entirely reasonable terms," Donovan said, "and I will send word today about the surveyor." He was as good as his word. By the following Tuesday, a surveyor named Harold Graves had come out from the county seat and walked the boundary line with his instruments and his notebooks, and confirmed what Edmund Carver had been insisting for 2 years, that the fence line had been moved east by precisely 3 yards sometime in the summer of 1877, and that the original survey markers placed in 1873 put the line exactly where Carver said it was. Roy Pickett turned very red in the face when the report was filed, and he had a sharp and unpleasant conversation with Donovan about loyalty and employment, and Donovan listened to all of it without expression, and then said quietly that he had not been hired to confirm what Pickett wanted to believe, and that he stood by the survey. Ada heard about this from Millhaven's postmaster's wife, Martha Elkins, who heard it from the surveyor's assistant, who had been present. She heard it on Wednesday morning when she went into town for flour and thread, and she stood in the general store and felt something warm move through her that was not quite surprise, but was something adjacent to wonder. She had not gone back to her father's ranch. She had stayed at the Pickett Ranch in the small spare room of the main house that Roy Pickett's wife Clara had arranged for her, because Clara Pickett was a practical woman who understood that a young woman could not simply be sent home in disgrace, whatever her husband had tried to do, and who was privately furious with Roy for the whole business. Clara was a stout woman with gray-streaked hair and opinions she did not hesitate to share, and she had taken an immediate proprietary interest in Ada that felt almost like being mothered, which Ada had not had in 3 years, and which she found she was helpless against. "Donovan is a good man," Clara told her on the third morning, standing at the stove stirring grits. "Better than Roy deserves as a foreman if you want my honest opinion. Steady as a fence post and twice as reliable. He came to us from Kansas 2 years ago with nothing but a good horse and an excellent reputation, and he has never once given me reason to question him." "I am aware he is a good man," Ada said, helping herself to coffee. "That is not the issue." "What is the issue?" Clara asked. Ada thought about it. "I want to choose," she said. "I want it to actually be my choice." Clara looked at her with something like recognition. "Child," she said, "every woman in this territory understands that wanting." The first Sunday afternoon, Donovan came to the main house with his hat in his hand, and a jar of apple preserves that he had apparently made himself, which surprised Clara Pickett so much she laughed out loud, and he sat with Ada on the porch steps in the late afternoon sun, and they talked for 2 hours about books mostly. She had noticed the books in his house and asked about them, and he lit up in a way she had not seen in him yet, a kind of quiet enthusiasm that changed the geography of his face, and he talked about the novels he had read through Wyoming winters and the history books he had ordered from a catalog in Cheyenne, and she talked about the poetry she loved and the collection she kept and the poems she had read until the pages were soft with handling. "Which poets?" he asked. "Tennyson," she said. "And Walt Whitman, although my father disapproved. And Emily Dickinson, who is not widely read but should be." "I have a volume of Whitman," he said, with an expression that suggested he was pleased to have this in common with her. "What do you love about him?" she asked, genuinely curious. He thought about it. "He does not lie about what is large," he said finally. "He looks at very big things and names them without flinching. I respect that." She looked at him sideways. "That is a good answer," she said. "You sound surprised," he said. "I am not surprised," she said, and she was aware that this was true. She had stopped being surprised by Jeremiah Donovan fairly quickly, and had started simply paying attention, which was its own kind of pleasure. The second Sunday, he brought the Whitman volume and they sat under the cottonwood trees and traded passages back and forth, and she read to him from Dickinson from her own worn book, and he listened with the same quality of genuine attention he brought to everything, and the afternoon light came through the yellowing leaves and fell across the pages and across his hands, and Ada thought, sitting there with her boots in the grass, that she had never felt less like disputed land in her life. He asked on the third Sunday how she was finding the situation with her father. She had spoken to Edmund Carver twice since leaving, once briefly at the general store, and once when he had come to the Pickett Ranch to apologize, which had been a short and painful conversation conducted on the porch with Clara Pickett hovering in the doorway. Her father was not a man who understood how to be wrong. He had said he was sorry in the voice of a man who was sorry he had upset her rather than sorry for what he had done, and Ada had accepted it because she loved him despite herself, and because she was not yet sure what to do with the larger anger she carried. He did not know how to manage alone, she told Donovan. After my mother died, he was never cruel before that. He was never easy either, but he was not cruel. She paused. What he did was cruel. Yes, Donovan said without softening it. He still does not fully understand that, she said. Some people cannot see the cruelty in doing what they believe is practical, he said. That does not make it less cruel, she looked at him. You are very direct. Would you prefer I was not, he asked. No, she said. I have had enough of indirection to last me a considerable time. He nodded. Then what do you want, Ada? Not about your father, just in general. What does your life look like when you imagine it going well? No one had ever asked her that. Not once in 22 years, not even her mother, who had been a gentle woman but a product of her time and circumstances. Ada sat with the question for a moment, feeling its weight and its unusual generosity. I want to read books, she said slowly. I want to have a kitchen garden and grow things that are mine. I want to be useful in ways that I choose. I want to talk to someone every day who is actually listening. She paused. I want not to be afraid. Are you afraid now? He asked. A little, she said honestly, of making a wrong choice, of letting the fact that you were kind to me convince me of something I have not yet properly examined. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that is exactly the right thing to be careful about. I want you to examine it properly. I have no interest in a woman who is with me because she was afraid not to be. Ada turned and looked at him in the slanted October light, this man with the steady hands and the brown eyes and the wildflowers on the kitchen table, and she thought that she had not expected any of this. She had expected to be managed. She had expected to be an arrangement. She had not expected to sit under cottonwood trees on Sunday afternoons and be asked what she wanted, what she imagined, what she feared. Jeremiah, she said. It was the first time she had used his given name, and she saw him notice it. Yes, he said. I would like to see your house again, she said. Properly, with you showing me what is in it and why. He looked at her for a moment, and then he smiled, fully, the same real laugh she remembered from the church social but softer, a smile that reached all the way up, and she thought that she would like to spend a great deal of time being the reason for that particular expression. They walked to his house that afternoon with Clara Pickett's blessing, which was given with a pointed reminder about propriety, and an hour's time limit that both of them accepted with straight faces and broke by approximately 20 minutes. He showed her the books and told her about each one. He showed her the needlework on the wall and told her it was something his mother had made, that she had come from County Clare in Ireland as a young woman, and that the words meant "May the road rise to meet you," the old blessing, the one everyone gave because the road was usually doing the opposite. He told her his mother had died when he was 15, and his father had worked the Kansas plains until his back gave out, and that he had been working ranches since he was 17, moving west by degrees, looking for land of his own someday. Land of your own, she said, sitting in his kitchen with the cook stove ticking warmth into the room. A modest amount, he said. Nothing grand. Enough for a house and a kitchen garden and a few horses. She looked at him, he looked at her. The cook stove ticked. You said kitchen garden, she said. I did, he said, and his eyes were warm with awareness of what he had just said and what she had heard in it. That is interesting, she said carefully. It is, he agreed just as carefully. They sat with that for a comfortable moment that neither of them felt the need to break too quickly. October deepened into November, and the Wyoming territory pulled on its gray coat, and the cottonwood trees went bare and the ground hardened, and Ada Carver continued to call Sundays her particular kind of heaven. She moved from Clara Pickett's spare room to a boarding arrangement with Martha Elkins in Millhaven, which was more proper and also more independent, and she began helping Martha in the post office 3 days a week in exchange for her room, which gave her something to do with her hands and her mind, and brought her into the daily life of the town in a way she found she loved. Millhaven was not a large town. It had a main street with a general store, a post office, a livery, a saloon, a church, a doctor's office, and a schoolhouse that doubled as the town hall for meetings. It had approximately 300 permanent residents and a fluctuating population of ranch hands, drifters, and the occasional very lost traveler. It had a newspaper that came out twice a week from a press that the editor, a thin and perpetually ink-stained man named Samuel Howe, operated with the intensity of a man who believed that information was oxygen, and a town without a good newspaper would simply suffocate. Ada liked Samuel Howe because he had opinions about books and was not shy about them, and they fell into the habit of arguing cheerfully about literature on the mornings when she came to collect the mail, and he was standing outside his print shop with his coffee and his ink-stained fingers. She also, gradually and with some surprise, began to talk with the other women of Millhaven in the way she had not been able to do growing up somewhat isolated on the ranch. There was Frances Holloway, who ran the schoolhouse and who was the sharpest-minded woman Ada had ever met, and whose friendship felt like coming into a bright room. There was Ruth Begay, who had married a Navajo man named Thomas Begay and lived just outside town, and who came to trade at the general store twice a month, and who looked at the world with the watchful eyes of someone who understood very well what it was to be seen as less than what she was, and with whom Ada eventually had a careful and honest conversation about what it meant to be handed over, and who said, quietly, that her people had suffered versions of that dispossession on a scale, and with a violence that made Ada's situation look like a minor discourtesy, but that the root of it was the same insistence that some people's wants did not count. Ada thought about that conversation for a long time afterward. She thought about it in the context of what she knew of the territory, of the way the land had been taken and parceled and disputed, and the people who had lived on it longest made invisible in the legal architecture. It made her own anger about her father's decision feel both entirely valid and also like a single thread in a much larger and more painful cloth. She told Donovan about it on a Sunday afternoon in November, walking the road between Millhaven and the ranch because the weather was cold but clear, and they were both the kind of people who needed to move when they talked. He listened carefully, as he always did. Then he said, "Thomas Begay worked here before I came. He is an excellent horseman. Pickett would not keep him on because of what he was, not because of any fault in his work. I thought it was wrong." "Did you say so?" she asked. "I did," he said. "Pickett told me it was not my concern. I have not forgotten it." He paused. "There are a great many things in this territory that are done wrong and called practical." She looked at him sideways, like handing daughters over to settle land disputes. "Exactly like that," he said, and reached over without ceremony and took her hand where it was tucked against her side in her coat pocket, and she let him, and they walked the rest of the cold, bright road with their fingers interlaced, and neither of them made any comment about it. It was the first time he had touched her with deliberate tenderness, and Ada catalogued it alongside the other things she was accumulating about him. The way he moved through the world with his quiet and genuine attention, the way he said what he meant and meant what he said, the books, the wildflowers, the Irish needlework from his mother, the surveyor he had sent without being asked, the hand easy and warm in hers on a November road. She admitted to herself that evening sitting in Martha Elkins's parlor with her book open and unread in her lap, falling in love with him. She had not meant to, or rather she had been scrupulous about not deciding to do it before she was ready, but it appeared that her heart had been conducting its own examination while her careful mind was occupied with being sensible, and had arrived at its conclusion somewhat ahead of schedule. She was not frightened of it. She had expected to be frightened, but she was not. It felt like the surveyor's report coming back, and saying that the line was where you had always said it was, a confirmation of something that had been true all along, waiting for someone with the right instruments to come along and confirm it. Winter came down on the Wyoming territory with its full authority in December, and the world went white and still and enormous. And Ada's Sundays with Donovan shifted from outdoor walking to sitting by the fire at Martha Elkins's parlor, which Martha allowed with great graciousness, and a pointed increase in the frequency with which she passed through the room carrying things. They talked and read and argued and laughed, and the fire burned low and was built up again, and December turned the corner toward Christmas. There was a Christmas social at the church, the same church where they had first properly talked, and Ada wore her good wool dress with the green trim and pinned her dark hair up carefully. And when she walked in and found Donovan already there talking with Samuel Howe near the window, he stopped mid-sentence when he saw her and looked at her in a way that Samuel Howe noticed and smirked about for the rest of the evening. Donovan crossed the room and said simply that she looked beautiful, without any qualification or embarrassment, just a statement of fact, and Ada said thank you and felt the warmth of it move through her like something she had been needing for a long time. They danced badly and then better. He had not danced much, he told her, apologizing for his feet. She had not danced much either, she told him, and they stumbled through the first reel together with more goodwill than technique and came out of it laughing. "We are not well suited for dancing," he said. "We are adequately suited for dancing," she said firmly. "We need practice." "Are you proposing we practice dancing?" he asked. "I am proposing we become competent at something we both clearly enjoy attempting," she said, which made him laugh again, that full real laugh, and she thought, here in the warm church-room with the candles burning and the fiddle playing and the winter dark held at bay outside the frosted windows, that she was happy. Genuinely, solidly, surprisingly happy. On Christmas Eve he gave her a book. It was a collection of Emily Dickinson's poems, a proper bound edition that he had ordered months ago from a bookshop in Cheyenne, and he had somehow known, or perhaps simply paid attention when she had talked about the worn spine of her own copy. And inside the front cover he had written, in his clean, careful hand, "For Ada, who sees clearly and speaks truly, December 1879. She looked at the inscription for a long moment, standing in Martha Elkins's parlor with the candle in its brass holder casting its warm light on the page, and she pressed the book very carefully against her chest for a moment. And then she looked up at Donovan, who was watching her with those steady, warm eyes. "I did not get you a gift," she said. "I did not know if we were doing gifts." "You do not owe me anything," he said. "Jeremiah," she said. "Yes." "I am done examining," she said. He looked at her carefully. "Done examining what?" "What I told you I needed to examine properly," she said. "My choice, my actual feelings as opposed to gratitude or circumstance." She held his gaze steadily. "I have examined it very thoroughly for 3 months, and the conclusion is not ambiguous." He was very still, the way he went still when something mattered. "What is the conclusion?" he asked quietly. "I am in love with you," she said. "And I wanted you to know that so that if you are of a similar mind, we can stop being quite so careful about everything." A beat of silence. The fire in the grate popped. Then Jeremiah Donovan crossed the 3 feet between them in 2 steps and took her face in both his hands very gently, the way you would hold something irreplaceable, and kissed her. It was a careful kiss first, and then it was not careful at all, and her hands found the front of his coat, and the Emily Dickinson book got slightly crumpled between them, and neither of them cared. When they separated, his forehead was against hers and they were both breathing somewhat unevenly, and he said, with that quality of complete honesty that she had come to love in him, "I have been in love with you since you rode up to my fence on that horse with your jaw set and your carpet-bag in your hand and told me you had not been asked." She laughed against his jaw. "That was the least romantic moment of my life. It was one of the most remarkable things I had ever seen," he said. "You were furious and frightened, and you were not going to let either of those things move you 1 inch from your own dignity. I thought I had never seen anyone so entirely themselves." She pulled back and looked at him. "You thought all of that in the first 5 minutes." "I thought a great deal in the first 5 minutes," he said, and the expression on his face was the Whitman one, the one he wore when he was looking at something very large and naming it without flinching. She kissed him again because she could, and because Christmas was tomorrow, and because the winter was pressing its white silence against the windows, and because she was entirely herself in this room with this man who saw it clearly. Martha Elkins came through the room twice in quick succession, carrying increasingly implausible objects, and they broke apart both times with entirely transparent innocence. And Martha said, on the second pass, without looking at either of them, Reverend Collins will be pleased to discuss dates in January, which was such a masterpiece of pointed commentary that Ada buried her face in Donovan's shoulder to hide her laughter. He proposed properly on New Year's Day, 1880, in the churchyard after the morning service, which was still covered in snow and very cold, with a ring he had also ordered from Cheyenne, a plain silver band with a small turquoise stone that he said he had chosen, because it reminded him of the Wyoming sky in summer, and he asked her with the same directness he brought to everything, standing in the snow with his hat in his hand and his breath making small clouds in the cold air, whether she would do him the honor of marrying him of her own free will and full choosing, and she said yes, clearly and warmly, and the turquoise stone caught the winter light when he slid it onto her finger and glittered like a piece of summer in the middle of January. Edmund Carver was told by letter, written by Ada herself, clear and honest and without apology. She wrote that she was to be married to Jeremiah Donovan, that she wanted him to know and to come to the wedding if he chose, and that she loved him despite everything, but that she needed him to understand that this marriage was her own choice made in her own time and had nothing to do with his arrangement. She sealed the letter and gave it to Martha for the post and felt, after it left her hands, something that was lighter than forgiveness but was moving in that direction. Edmund Carver came to the post office 3 days later alone without his horse, which meant he had walked 8 miles from the ranch, which told her something. He stood in the doorway of the post office with his hat turning in his hands and his dust-colored eyes doing something she had not seen them do before, filling with an expression that was genuinely contrite rather than just embarrassed. "I did wrong by you," he said. "Not just what I arranged, but before it too. Your whole life I let you grow up knowing I wished you were a son. That was wrong. You are better than any son I could have had, and I was too blind to see it until you had the backbone to ride away." It was the most his father had ever said. It was not perfect, and it did not undo anything, and Ada was not going to pretend it did. But she looked at this lean, weathered, badly lost man who was her father, and she thought of her mother's face, and she thought of the 3 years he had been alone and the terrible logic he had followed in that loneliness, and she said, "You can come to the wedding, Papa. I would like you there." He nodded once sharply, like a man who does not trust himself to speak further, and put his hat back on and walked back out into the January cold. And Ada watched him go through the small post office window and felt the piece of her that had been hard and held since September soften slightly at its edges. The wedding was in February, on a day when the sky was the exact color of the turquoise on her ring, that improbable Wyoming blue that appears on winter days like an apology for all the gray. And the church was full of Millhaven's people who had, over the months of the courtship, quietly but entirely taken Ada's side in the original story, and viewed Donovan's part in it with the warm approval of a community that understands when something right has happened. Clara Pickett was there in her best hat. Martha Elkins was there with an expression of profound self-satisfaction. Samuel Howe was there with ink-stained fingers, standing next to Frances Holloway, who had brought her students to the church steps to witness the arrival of the bride because she believed, Frances said, that her students should see a woman arrive at her wedding standing upright and smiling freely. Ruth and Thomas Begay were there, sitting together near the back with the quiet dignity of people who had driven a considerable distance and intended to be exactly where they were. Ada had invited them herself, specifically and personally, because she wanted them there and because she understood, imperfectly but genuinely, something of what their presence in that church meant in a world that was often not welcoming. Edmund Carver walked her down the aisle. He was stiff with the emotion of it and his eyes were very bright. And halfway down the aisle Ada took his arm more firmly and felt him exhale a long breath, and they walked the rest of the way to the altar together, which felt, for all its imperfection, like its own small kind of resolution. Jeremiah Donovan was standing at the altar in a dark coat and a clean white shirt, and his hair finally cut properly. And when he saw her come in through the church door, his whole face changed, broke open into something unguarded and luminous that Ada would remember for the rest of her life. The expression of a man who was seeing exactly what he wanted and could not entirely believe his luck. Reverend Collins performed the ceremony with appropriate ceremony and some warmth, and when he asked Ada if she took this man of her own free will, she said yes with a clarity and conviction that made Martha Elkins press her handkerchief to her mouth. And when he asked Donovan the same, Donovan said I do with the same direct simplicity he brought to everything, and looked at Ada while he said it, and Ada looked back. They were married on a Tuesday in February 1880, in a church full of people who were glad of it, under a sky the color of turquoise, in the Wyoming territory, which was not always a kind place but which had given them this. There was a reception at the Millhaven Town Hall, which was the schoolhouse with the desks pushed back, and a long table of food contributed by approximately everyone. And the fiddle player from the Christmas social was there again. And Ada and Donovan danced with the competence of people who had been practicing in Martha Elkins's parlor for 6 weeks, and they were still not excellent, but they were genuinely good. And when they finally were very good, when they hit a moment in a waltz where they were perfectly in time with each other and with the music, Donovan said quietly into her hair, "We got there," and she said, "I told you we needed practice," and felt his chest move with his laugh. Roy Pickett had not come to the wedding. He had not been invited. He had spent the autumn being quietly furious about the surveyor's report and the boundary line and Donovan's role in both. And in December he had told Donovan that he could consider his position available to someone who understood loyalty better. Donovan had accepted this news without visible distress, because he had been expecting it and had been planning accordingly. And in January, with the assistance of a loan from a banker in Cheyenne who had been convinced of the soundness of the investment by a detailed written proposal that Donovan had worked on through 3 Wyoming nights in a row, he had made an offer on 120 acres of land 6 miles north of Millhaven that had been sitting idle since its owner had moved to Denver. He had told Ada about the land before he made the offer. He had brought the proposal documents to her at the post office and spread them on the counter and asked her to read them, and she had read every page carefully while he waited, and then she had looked up and said, "The north pasture has good drainage and the soil is deep. I think you can winter cattle here through December at least if you expand the shelter from the existing barn," and he had stared at her for a moment and then started making notes. "Did you think I did not know about land management?" She asked. "I knew you grew up on a ranch," he said. "I underestimated how much you paid attention." "Everyone underestimates that," she said without rancor. "Not anymore," he said. The land was theirs by the time they were married, and the house on it, a sound but simple structure that needed work, became the project of their first spring together, which was the happiest spring Ada had lived through. They worked on the house together in the long evenings after the ranch work was done, him doing the structural repairs and her doing the things that made a structure into a place where people actually lived, the whitewash on the walls, the curtains in the windows, the kitchen shelves stocked with her preserves and his, because it turned out that he really had made those apple preserves himself, and that he was a good practical cook who had been feeding himself alone for 9 years and had developed opinions about it. Their kitchen had a long table and 2 good chairs and a cook stove that drew properly, and on the shelf above the window Ada put the jar of wildflowers that Donovan had kept continuous since she'd first noticed them, replenished season by season, whatever was available, dried in winter and fresh through the rest of the year, and she put her Warren Dickinson volume and his Whitman beside them, and the Irish needlework with the old blessing went on the wall above the doorway. "May the road rise to meet you." She learned what it said that spring when she finally asked him to translate it, and she thought, standing in her kitchen with the morning light coming through the curtain she had made, that the road had, against considerable odds, risen toward both of them. The cattle operation began small, which was correct and what they had planned. Donovan was a man who understood that the right pace was the pace that was sustainable, and Ada, who had grown up watching her father's small economies and his small catastrophes, agreed with him. They ran 30 head through the summer of 1880 and did well enough, and in the fall they went to the county cattle fair, and Ada sold her kitchen garden surplus at the market tables and turned a profit that surprised her and delighted Donovan, who had not known about the kitchen garden's expansion until he came home one evening and found it had nearly doubled in size. "You said you wanted a kitchen garden," he pointed out. "I said I wanted a kitchen garden," she agreed. "I did not specify the dimensions." He surveyed the enormity of it, the beans and the squash and the late tomatoes and the herbs in careful rows. "This is approximately a commercial operation," he said. "It is a productive kitchen garden," she said. "Ada," he said, with great affection, "the Millhaven General Store has offered to buy my preserves on a regular basis," she said. "I thought we should discuss it." They discussed it, and the result was a small but real secondary income that Ada managed, and that helped them through the second winter better than just the cattle would have done. And Donovan told her, in the serious way he had that made compliments feel like something weighty and true, that she was the most capable person he had ever met, and she took it in and felt it land, felt it sit easily in her because she had come to understand, allowed to know what she was good at. Her father came for Sunday dinner twice a month. This had begun tentatively, with a level of careful politeness on all sides, and evolved gradually into something more natural as the months passed, and Edmund Carver made the slow and imperfect work of understanding that the daughter he had dismissed for 22 years was building something real and fine with her own hands and her own judgment. He was good with the cattle still, whatever his other failings, and he and Donovan developed a careful mutual respect built on practical competence and the shared project of the ranch. And Ada watched it happen with complicated feelings that she sorted through honestly and found were mostly, in the end, gratitude. Her father's land dispute was finally resolved in the courts in the summer of 1880, fully in his favor, with the boundary line restored to its original position, and Roy Pickett fined for the cost of the court proceedings. Roy Pickett did not take this well, and sold his ranch by fall and moved somewhere east, and the Pickett property was bought by a family named Whitmore who were decent neighbors and eventually friends. Clara Pickett wrote Ada a letter from her new home in St. Louis, which was where she had always wanted to go and was considerably better suited to her than the Wyoming territory had ever been, and which contained the information that she was delighted to be in a city with proper shops and theaters, and did not miss the wind one bit, and that she was proud of Ada and hoped the ranch prospered. And that Roy had been wrong about everything, and she had told him so on a regular basis for 30 years, and intended to continue. Ada read the letter aloud to Donovan over dinner, and he smiled through most of it. The autumn of 1880 settled over the Wyoming territory in its full splendor, which was magnificent and brief, the cottonwoods going gold and the sky going that deep crystalline blue, and Ada, who was in the 3rd month of a pregnancy she had suspected since August and confirmed to herself in September, and told Donovan about on a Sunday evening with her hands wrapped around her teacup and her eyes watching his face, was feeling well, and was working at the post office 3 days a week still, and was reading everything she could find about what was coming. Donovan's response to the news had been to go very still for a moment, and then to take both her hands in his and look at her with an expression that combined pure happiness with something that was clearly worry about her health, about the considerable realities of childbearing in 1880 Wyoming, and she had said, reading him accurately, "I am healthy and Dr. Harmon has examined me and says everything is well, and I intend to be sensible about all of it." And he had nodded and believed her, and then had pressed her hands to his lips and held them there for a moment, and she had felt the emotion in him like a pulse. "Are you happy?" she asked. "I am terrified and overwhelmed and entirely happy," he said, which was so direct and so perfectly him that she laughed and he laughed, and they sat together in the kitchen they had made with the wildflowers on the shelf and the old blessing above the door. The winter was hard, but they were warm. They had put up good stores, and the cattle were sheltered, and there was enough wood for the stoves, and the evenings were long and companionable and full of the kind of talk that builds between two people who are genuinely interested in each other's thoughts. They talked about everything, about the ranch and the books and the politics of the territory, about the people they knew and the things they believed, about the past and the future, about what kind of world they wanted the child to come into. They disagreed sometimes, vigorously and without any damage to the fundamental warmth between them, because they had both learned, each in their own way, the value of two people who could speak honestly with each other. She woke him one March night when the snow was still deep on the ground, to tell him it was time, and he was dressed and had the horse saddled and Dr. Harmon in from town within an hour, which was remarkable given the state of the roads, and the labor was long but not dangerous. And as the sun was coming up on a bright March morning in 1881, their son was born. He was small and red-faced, and had a startling amount of dark hair and lungs that announced his presence with considerable authority. Donovan held him first at Ada's instruction because she wanted to watch his face, and his face did what she had known it would do. It went open and luminous and unguarded, the way it had at the church door on their wedding day, and he held his son with the careful reverent attention he gave to everything that mattered to him, and Ada, tired and happy and hurting and more awake than she had ever been, watched the two of them and felt something enormous and simple move through her. "What shall we name him?" Donovan asked, still looking at the baby, who was looking back at him with the unfocused philosophical regard of the very newborn. "I would like to call him James," Ada said. "After your father, if you are willing. You said he was a good man, and I think a good man's name is a fine thing to give a son." Donovan looked up from the baby at her, and she saw him working to keep his composure, which he mostly managed. "James," he said. "James Donovan," she said. "What do you think?" "I think that is a very fine name," he said, with a roughness in his voice he did not try to conceal, and he brought the baby over and sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and they looked at James together in the March morning light that was coming golden through the curtains she had made. Frances Holloway came by later that week, bringing food and books and the cheerful briskness of a woman who had herself been through childbirth, and knew that what a new mother needed was practical assistance and good conversation. She held James with expert confidence, and told Ada that he looked extremely healthy and extremely opinionated, which Ada suspected was accurate. Martha Elkins came and cried, which she would have denied to her last breath. Edmund Carver came and stood holding his grandson with the stiffness of a man who was feeling a great deal more than he had the language for, and he looked at Ada over the baby's head with eyes that said things he had never learned to say out loud, and Ada received them, because she was her mother's daughter as well as his, and her mother had always been able to read what he meant under what he said. The summer of 1881 was their best yet on the ranch. James grew fat and determined and opinionated, exactly as Frances had predicted, and developed an early and emphatic preference for being outside, which meant Ada spent a great deal of the summer carrying him on her back in the carrier she had made from good wool while she worked in the kitchen garden, which had expanded again, and was now definitively a commercial concern, and she did not call it a kitchen garden to anyone outside the family anymore. Donovan had built her a proper greenhouse along the south wall of the barn for starting seedlings in early spring, and she had used it to get a 6-week advantage on the season that the Millhaven General Store valued very much. In the fall, Donovan made a partnership agreement with 2 neighboring ranchers that allowed them to pool resources for the winter and share grazing rights in a way that benefited all 3 operations, which was his particular gift, Ada thought, the ability to see how things fit together and to build structures that held. She told him this one evening when James was asleep and they were sitting together on the porch steps in the September dusk, and he said, with the slight shyness he showed when he was genuinely moved, that he had learned from her. That watching her build the post office work and the garden business and the friendships and the relationship with her father, he had understood better what it looked like when someone was doing what they were made for. "What am I made for?" she asked, genuinely curious about his answer. "Knowing what is real," he said, "and making things grow. And I think making everyone around you more honest than they would be without you, because you see through everything and people know it." She thought about that. "You make me sound slightly terrifying," she said. "You are slightly terrifying," he said, with complete warmth. "It is one of the things I love most about you." She leaned against his shoulder in the September dusk, and he put his arm around her, and they sat there on their porch steps on their land. And the stars were coming out one by one over the enormous Wyoming sky, and James made a small sound from inside the house that was not a distress sound, but just a sleeping child's sound. And Ada thought about the morning she had packed her carpet bag and set her jaw and ridden 4 miles without knowing what she was riding toward. She thought about the fence and the water bucket and the man who had said "you are not disputed," and asked what she wanted. She thought about cottonwood trees in October and Whitman and Dickinson and Sunday afternoons, and dancing badly and dancing well and Christmas Eve and turquoise and January snow and the old Irish blessing above the door. She thought that the road had risen to meet her in a way she had not dared to imagine. "Jeremiah," she said. "Ada," he said, with his arm around her and the stars coming out. "I am glad I rode over that morning," she said. "I am glad you did not turn around and ride back," he said. "I thought about it," she said. "I know," he said. "I am glad you did not." They sat together on the porch in the September dark until it was properly night and the stars were in full assembly, and the air had gone cool and sweet with the smell of the dying summer grass. And then they went inside to their home, to the books on the shelves and the wildflowers and the Irish needlework and the baby asleep in the next room. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The following spring brought news that the Wyoming Territory was moving toward statehood, which was the subject of considerable discussion at every gathering in Millhaven, and which Ada followed with the attention of a woman who had always paid attention to the structures that governed people's lives, and who had developed, through Francis Holloway's friendship and Samuel Howe's newspaper, and her own experience, a clear and direct interest in the question of who got to be counted in those structures, and who did not. She wrote a letter to the territorial newspaper in Cheyenne about the question of women's participation in the coming constitutional process, which Samuel Howe published in his own paper first and then forwarded, and which generated both supportive mail and hostile mail, both of which she read carefully and filed and thought about. Donovan read the letter when it appeared in Samuel's paper, and looked up at her across the breakfast table with an expression that was pride and amusement and something else, something that was very specifically the face of a man who is in love with the precise person he is looking at. "You did not tell me you were writing this," he said. "I wanted to see what I had before I said it aloud," she said. "Do you disapprove?" "No," he said. "I think every word is right. I think you should write more." She did. Through the spring and summer of 1882, she wrote regularly for Samuel Howe's paper, on a range of subjects, and while not everything she wrote made everyone comfortable, she wrote everything with the clarity and honesty she brought to all things, and the paper's circulation increased, which Samuel Howe attributed directly to her contributions and said so publicly. James learned to walk that spring, with the emphatic determination that characterized everything he did, falling down and getting up and falling down again with an expression of pure concentrated will that made both his parents laugh, and that his grandmother Edmund Carver's wife would have recognized immediately had she been alive to see it. Because it was Ada's face at 18 months, Edmund said, when he came for Sunday dinner and watched his grandson navigate the kitchen floor. "He is very like you," Edmund said to Ada, and it was meant as the compliment it had taken him too long to understand how to give. "Thank you, Papa," she said, and meant it. By the summer of 1882, they had 60 head of cattle and a healthy operation, and a kitchen garden that Ada privately thought of as a farm because that was what it was, and a son who was saying words with great confidence, and picking up everything he could reach and bringing it to whoever would look at it, and a house that had been added onto twice and now had a proper parlor with bookshelves that were genuinely full. They had been married 2.5 years, and it felt to Ada, when she thought about it, like she had been becoming herself for all of it, like the person she had arrived at Donovan's fence being had been real but unfinished, and the years since had been the years of the finishing. She told him this on a Sunday afternoon when James was napping, and the summer rain was coming down soft and steady on the roof, and they were sitting in the parlor with their books and the lamplight, and he listened to her with his full attention, and then he said, "I think you were entirely finished when you arrived. I think you have just had more room to be what you already were." "That is a kind way to see it," she said. "It is the accurate way," he said. She set her book in her lap and looked at him, this man she had chosen fully and freely and well, with his dark hair that still needed cutting and his steady brown eyes and the quality of genuine attention that had not dimmed in any particular over all the time she had known him. "I love you," she said, which she said often because it was true, and because she had lived long enough under a silence about true things to know better than to maintain one. "I love you," he said, and looked at her the way he looked at very large things he was naming without flinching, like it was the most accurate and necessary sentence available. The rain came down soft on their roof, on their land, on the kitchen garden and the barn and the north pasture and the cottonwood trees along the fence, and Ada Carver Donovan sat in her parlor on a Sunday afternoon with her book and her husband and the sleeping sound of her son from the next room, and felt the road risen up under her feet, solid and wide, and going forward into a future she had been given the grace to choose. In the years that followed, the ranch continued to grow steadily under the partnership of two people who were each better at different things, and had the good sense to know it and the trust to act on it. Donovan expanded the cattle operation in the careful increments he believed in, always with one eye on the land and one on the finances, never overextending, building the kind of quiet prosperity that does not make headlines but weathers drought and hard winters without breaking. Ada's market garden became genuinely well known in the county, supplying 3 general stores by 1884, and she had hired 2 women from town to help her through the growing seasons, which she managed with the same clear-eyed efficiency she brought to everything, paying them properly and treating them as the capable people they were. James was a bright and active child who learned to read early and had strong opinions about everything, and a gift for horses that showed itself by the time he was 4, when he was found most mornings in the barn, with the horses talking to them in serious undertones that nobody could quite hear. Donovan taught him what he knew about horses with a patience and care that Ada watched from the barn door sometimes with her heart very full, watching her husband crouch down to her son's level and speak to him seriously about horses and land and how things worked, giving him the kind of knowing attention she had so wanted at that age and had not had. Their daughter was born in the fall of 1883, in easier circumstances than James had been, or perhaps Ada simply knew better what to expect, and she arrived in the world with less drama than her brother and a pair of very direct gray eyes that looked at everything around her with immediate assessment. They named her Margaret for Ada's mother, who had been a gentle and perceptive woman who had deserved more than her life had given her, and whose name felt like both a memorial and a promise. Edmund Carver held his granddaughter on the Sunday after her birth and sat very quietly with her for a long time, and Ada, watching him, thought that he was making the kind of peace with things that old men make when they are honest enough to reckon with what they have and have not done, and she let him sit with it, because it was his to do. James was entranced by his sister in a way that surprised the adults and then did not surprise them at all, because it was exactly consistent with his character, which was fiercely loyal to whatever he decided was his. He sat next to her basket for long stretches of time and reported on her activities in great detail, which were limited at first but which he found endlessly significant. "She looked at me," he told his father on day 3. "She did," Donovan confirmed. "She knows me already," James said with satisfaction. "I believe she does," Donovan said. The winter of 1883 was the hardest one they had seen, cold enough to crack the water barrels and long enough to test everyone's reserves of firewood and patience and good temper. They came through it with the cattle intact, which was not nothing, and with their stores drawn down but not exhausted. And when the spring came in April with its sudden and total transformation of the territory, Ada went out into the kitchen garden on the first warm morning and stood in the mud and the thin new sun and felt the renewal of it like a physical thing. The territory of Wyoming was admitted to the Union in 1890, though they followed the long road to it through all the years of discussion and politics and the particular chaos of a place that was still defining itself. Wyoming's constitution, when it was written, included women's suffrage, a fact that had been true at the territorial level since 1869, but that the constitutional inclusion made permanent and indelible. Ada Donovan voted in the first state election with Margaret on her hip and James at her side, and she marked her ballot with the pen the election official handed her and felt, standing in the Millhaven schoolhouse that had been a church social and a wedding venue and a town hall, and was now a polling place, that something had been confirmed about the kind of world she had been working to build. She told Donovan about it that evening at the kitchen table with the lamp burning between them and the children asleep and the autumn dark settled fully around the house, and he listened and said that he was glad, and that he had voted that morning thinking about her, thinking about what it meant that the world was, slowly and imperfectly, beginning to ask more women what they wanted. "Like someone told it too," she said, with a glimmer. "Something like that," he said, with the smile she had been collecting for 11 years. Frances Holloway had by this time been teaching in Millhaven for over a decade, and had become the kind of institution that small towns build their character around, the person who had educated most of the children, and who was therefore woven into the memory of the place. She and Ada had a friendship that had deepened over the years into something mutual and sustaining, the kind of friendship where you can disagree vigorously and laugh about it afterward, and know that the structure of the thing is sound. Frances came to dinner once a week when the weather permitted, and she and Ada and Donovan talked about books and the state of things, and the children and the great rolling questions of the age. And James and Margaret grew up with the understanding that dinner-table conversation was a serious and enjoyable endeavor that required your full participation. Ruth and Thomas Begay remained at the edges of Ada's world and were valued there, and Ada was honest with herself about the limits of her understanding and the asymmetry of their situations in a territory that was built on displacement and violence done to Thomas's people. And she did not pretend those things were resolved or resolvable simply by her awareness of them. What she could do, she did. She bought from Thomas's horse-trading operation and recommended it. She made sure the Millhaven General Store stocked the woven blankets that Ruth made because there was a market for them, and the income was fair. She bore witness when she could, which was imperfect and incomplete, but was not nothing. The ranch passed through its seasons and its years. The cattle herd grew and was managed through good years and difficult ones with the consistent care of people who understood that stewardship was a long game. The kitchen garden, which Ada had long since acknowledged was a farm, employed 4 women by 1890, and was one of the most reliable suppliers to the county. And Ada took a quiet and genuine satisfaction in having built something that was hers, and that also made other people's lives more possible. James, at 12, was already the best young horseman in the county, which was saying something in Wyoming, and he had his father's quality of genuine attention and his mother's clear-eyed assessment, and the combination was formidable in a boy and would be remarkable in a man. Margaret, at 8, had opinions about everything and an aptitude for mathematics that Francis Holloway declared exceptional and intended to cultivate. And she had Ada's dark hair and Donovan's steady gaze, and a personality that was entirely her own, which was the best thing that could be said of a person. Ada Donovan was 33 years old and stood in her kitchen on a Tuesday morning in early summer watching the light come through the curtain she had made 11 years ago, replacing the originals, made from the same pattern but in better cloth because they could afford it now. And she made the coffee and thought about the morning she had packed a carpet bag and ridden 4 miles not knowing what she was riding toward. She thought about it sometimes, not with the weight of the original grief but with something that was almost gratitude for the shape of it, the way the worst morning had turned toward the best life, the way the road had risen. She thought about what she had told Donovan she wanted, that first day, sitting in his kitchen with the wildflowers on the table, books, and a kitchen garden, and to be useful in ways she chose, and to talk to someone every day who was listening and not to be afraid. She had all of those things. She had considerably more than all of those things. Donovan came in from the morning chores with the smell of the outdoor air on his coat, and James behind him in animated conversation about a horse he had been watching in the north pasture. And Margaret came down the stairs with her arithmetic book already under her arm, because she was going to Francis's schoolroom this morning, and she did not like to be late, and the kitchen filled with the morning voices of her family. And Ada poured the coffee and put the bread on the table and felt the solidity of it. The reality of this life that she had not been handed, but had walked into on her own 2 feet with her jaw set, and her carpet bag, and her refusal to be anyone's settlement. She looked at Donovan across the kitchen, over James's head as he talked and over Margaret's as she read her arithmetic while eating, and he caught her looking and raised an eyebrow in the way that meant, "What are you thinking?" And she smiled at him, because the answer was everything, because the answer was you, because the answer was the road rose and I am standing on it. He smiled back, that full real smile she had been cataloging since the church social in the spring of 1879, that had not lost one element of its realness in all the years since. James finished his account of the horse. Margaret finished her arithmetic problem and looked up satisfied. The coffee was poured. The bread was buttered. Outside the window the Wyoming summer was beginning its slow, bright work on the land they had built together. The pastures and the garden and the fences and the cottonwood trees along the north boundary that were tall now and cast real shade. Edmund Carver had died the previous winter, quietly in his sleep, in his own house on his own land that the courts had confirmed was his, and that would pass now to Ada, which she and Donovan had already discussed and agreed they would fold carefully into their own operation without erasing its history. She had grieved him, genuinely and fully, in the complicated way that you grieve a father who was not what he should have been and who became, in the end, more than he had started as. She had buried him beside her mother in the churchyard in Millhaven, and stood at the graveside in the January cold with Donovan's hand warm in hers and James's hand in her other hand and Margaret pressed against her side, and she had said good-bye to him with honesty and with love. The land was hers now, and she was no one's settlement, and the road had risen, and she was standing on it with her family around her on a summer morning with the coffee hot and the bread on the table and everything resolved and warm and real. She was standing on it, and it felt, as it had felt every morning for more years than she could now count with anything like accuracy, like the most solid ground she had ever known. Outside, the summer moved through the cottonwood trees, and the grasses bent in the easy wind, and the Wyoming sky was the exact color of the turquoise on her ring, that improbable blue that appeared like an apology and stayed like a promise. Inside, her family was alive and real and particular around her kitchen table, talking and reading and being exactly themselves. And Carver Donovan, who had once been handed over like a piece of contested land and had refused, quietly and completely, to be that, set her coffee down and sat down among them. And the morning went forward into the day, and the day went forward into the life, and it was good.